This is partly a list of the topics I'm going to talk about, but also some inspirations. So some of these things on the list will not be very visible. I will talk about texts versus maps. I will talk a bit and are quite a lot inspired by drug studies, poetry and painting, blessing, actions in time connected in distinction to bodies in space, which was one of his major distinctions, but also the science system question he was working on. The difference between painting and poetry, whereas to whether what was hidden could be seen. The statue with clothes on hid the body, whereas in text or in poetry, clothes will not hide the body. These kinds of distinctions. I will also connect, or at least I'm inspired by intermedia study, a recent book by Ellerström talking about media modalities, which I will come not very much back to, but in a way you can see it as a generalization of Lessing. This idea that, which is obviously not new, but is organized very well by Ellerström, the fact that each medium has the capacity of mediating only certain aspects of the total reality. It's not that simple, of course. I will talk about the method, stepwise formalisation, which has been used in computer science for decades, but I'm using it in a more critical sense. I will give examples of differences between texts and maps, and I might say something about how this can enrich intermedia studies, perhaps. So, stepwise formalisation. This snippet is taken from some 18th century border protocols, and in the text there is a measurement where they say 8 miles. And even within the context, it's not quite clear what that means. They used a number of different types of miles, for instance. So, what I did in this modeling exercise was to build up a model of the reading of the text in the conceptual modeling tool I developed, basically a computer program. And started from the text, turning the text into more and more formal statements. So I said, okay, 8 miles, a recent interpretation of that is it's the number 8. Pretty straightforward. And in the context, that specific quote is taken from, it's what they call mountain miles, which was different from, for instance, an official mile at that time. And based on again, given the context, reasonable interpretation, that might be 64 kilometers. And 64 kilometers, and if you know the distance straight east, put it on the map and you have 2 coordinates. This is a stepwise way to go from a text to a map. What I'm looking for here is not to create maps based on texts, but to see what's lost in the process. So thus, it's not a stepwise formalization as such, it's a critical one. And things I found were, not surprisingly again, things like the context, vagueness expressed in the text, under-specification in the text, which I will come back to, things like negation and disjunction. And the idea was to try to create some sort of record of these bottom things in order to abstract a bit more general thinking from that and see how it relates to previous research. The point here is not to put them on pre-existing maps, but to see what kind of maps can be created from the text only, which is of course impossible because there's only context, but trying to limit the context as much as possible. And it is quite clear that there are 2 problems when you want to make a map based on a text. You have too little information and you have too much information. Too little information means that you don't have enough to make one specific map. There is always options for making different maps because the text doesn't really describe very much. Even this very descriptive text about legal and border and political issues, non-fiction text was still not very descriptive. Less than 10% of the places mentioned had any kind of description of the size of it, or orientation, or how it looked. And it's also too much information. There are things which are actually quite difficult to map from the text. I will come back to that. Under specification in the definition I use, you can see it there. And this is a map based on a short snippet of the text where you have one place, another place south of it, then you have a third place halfway south of the first one, and this is within another place, and it's between 2 places. Okay? This map is correct, or at least it expresses the information in the text. But so does that map. because south can of course mean a little bit with an eastward bend. The text says nothing about the size of this area. It doesn't say anything about the distance or directions in the between relationship. So the point is, the text is underspecified, which is basically no surprise. Too much information if things like in north of there are no peasant farms. Negation, that's tricky. The blank on the map doesn't say no farms, it says nothing of interest here. And this kind of specific negation statements can be made for certain categories of information in the map system when you have this kind of paratext for the map giving the completeness definition. But it's very hard to make it in this kind of reluctant, easy, sentence by sentence, type by type thing you can do in the text. And this is another thing. The text mentions that either this mountain or that mountain is a border mountain that is crossing the red line of the mountain. Whereas in this map made by the same person, both mountains are put on the border because it's very hard to make the or fact on the map, apart from putting a text saying or on it. Of course. You can do it maybe with dynamic mapping. And then there is sometimes an expression that the distance in one direction is different from this distance the other direction. I'll come back to this. Then I tried to play a little with this method and this thinking based on Ishiguro's book, The Unconsoled, from 1995. And this is a short preliminary study of chapter 10 of the book. The book is basically, it describes a surreal world at many levels, also spatially, but also persons and everything. It's totally surreal. What I tried to do was look at all the movement in this chapter to see, because it describes an impossible world, in a way, to see whether this is a semantic thing or a pragmatic thing. That was just a simplified question in a way to organize my own thoughts about it. What happens is that the protagonist starts in a hotel in the city, is taken down in his dressing gown, and he suddenly realizes he's going to a party to give a speech. So there's a long, long travel through the city, lots of queue in the city, then they go out in the countryside and travel for a long time in the countryside. And it's quite clear that they're traveling in not one direction, but they're traveling away. They're not traveling, they're going somewhere. They end up in a country house where the dinner will be. And then after a long dinner with lots of things going on, he realizes that the dining hall in the country house is really connected to the lobby of the hotel through a long corridor. So it happens to be at the same place as where he started in the first place. And of course there are a number of possible interpretations of this. It could be a circuit travel, but it doesn't make sense. They go out of the city, they don't go back to the city. It could be a transformation, this kind of science fiction, morphic and going from teleportation, something like that. But it doesn't make sense because it says in the novel quite explicitly, I realize now that this place is the rest of the hotel is over there. So it must be some sort of non-geometrical real space, or the dining room is in two buildings at the same place. But these two buildings either doesn't really make any sense because it seems to be most likely that we're talking about a space where something can be far away from something else and at the same place at the same time. Which is of course quite common and possible in some sort of literature. It's just incoherent distances. The length from A to B is different from the length from B to A, you can say. Or what it's really about is the fact that this is not reflexive. This is an expression of something which is not mappable. Because we cannot make this kind of simple solution and make a circle on a map and say they go back to the same place, because that is not coherent with what the text is actually saying. So what we are talking about here is that the sign systems of these two media works differently, partly in how they relate to their context. If I write this short thing, it does not imply that London is southeast of Oxford. Because the textual space in the document doesn't say anything in that geometrical sense about the relationships between places referred to by place names. This is obvious, of course. Towards the morning sun means that from Oxford I travel east. That's how direction is expressed in textual oral text, not as relationships in this kind of geometrical sense. Usually there are exceptions, of course, concrete plotting. Whereas on the map, these relationships are, of course, expressed in an indexical grid system. That indexical grid system don't have to be Cartesian. But I claim that in order to have some sort of sensible map definition, it has to be indexical, semiotically speaking. It has to have this kind of relationship which is based on some sort of spatial, if not similarity, then at least parallel. And on the map, the sound doesn't have any role at all. So what we're talking about is how syntax, and for maps what some people call syntactics, works differently. B is northeast of A is a vague statement, whereas on the map, when you put these two things on a map, it's very hard not to give two exact angles of the relationship between them. There are ways to try to push this, avoid this, but the immediate and easiest solution is to have this kind of exact relationship. Not exact in the meaning precise, true, or anything about the relationship to reality, but as a statement, it's precise. Whereas the textual statements is usually imprecise, and you have to go to quite significant length in language to make it precise. And for fictional language, it really makes an effect if you say this place is 67.3 degrees related to that. It doesn't really work in fiction. It really says something about I'm making this statement. It calls attention to itself. So if we go back to Lessing, he had this idea of aesthetic rules. He didn't claim that you couldn't describe breaking these rules he talked about, that you should use action in poetry and describe space in painting, but he said they were aesthetic rules. And of course, rules are important in literature, whether you break them or not. So in the little reading of Robinson Crusoe, which is similar to the first book in the way that, according to the paratext, it's a non-fiction book, although nobody believed it. This is an autobiography, according to that, or at least a biography, according to the title page of the first edition. So it's a claim for truthfulness, although we don't believe it to be truthful. It's self-posing as truth, as part of fiction. And here, the attempt is to look into the method here, not to really learn a lot of new things about Defoe. In Robinson Crusoe, you have 3 levels, scales of description. You have larger geographical areas. He's traveling between England, Brazil, parts of Africa, this island of his, and so on. And he uses place name dropping. He doesn't really describe or say anything, he just drops the place names. I traveled to Brazil, and people will know where it is. For smaller places, especially on his island, where he does it a lot, he uses description. Because the island don't exist, so he has to describe it. I think nobody's been there. And objects I'm not discussing here. What he does during the novel is to establish some sort of a place name system. And if this had been a real colonization project, some of these things, some of these descriptions he first uses, would probably have developed into place names. And of course, based on this definition, which I like, that's why I use it, many different place name definitions. The point is, a small community can develop, if it has a certain stability, this idea of one particular place called into attention by using a place name to this association of contiguity. And of course, such a community can be known quite clearly. So he established some sort of place name system which opens up for name dropping also in the island, but that is only a bit into the description of the island. He has to establish it first. And what he does is to do most of his descriptions through the narrative. This is what Lessing claimed was the right way to do it. You describe something through acts about the thing, not through this kind of description of each part of it. But there's one description where he takes a step back and really describes something, a long description, where it doesn't happen through the narrative. And this is where he says, but now I came to a new scene in my life. He'd been alone on the island since he went there for many years. And then it happened one day about noon, going towards my boat, I was exceedingly surprised with the print of a man's naked foot on the shore. Which of course would surprise him after a number of years alone. So, just before this happens, there's a long description of everything he has accomplished on his island. Then comes the sentence, but no, I come to a new scene of my life. So that sentence ends this long description. Why would it do that? Well, one possible effect is to slow down and prepare it. It's some kind of tempest feature. And also this kind of summarization. Get ready for this big shift into the new. But it's also curious to see from a man living in a house with a printing press. You see that the print of a foot, prepared by a geographical description, is in the very spatial center of the book, both word-wise and page-wise in the first edition. This is in the middle of the book. So it's a signal. Whether it wasn't put there by default or not, that's another question. But it's very, very hard not to read it significant in some way. And this significance is enhanced by the fact that it is prepared by breaking the descriptive rule of Lessing, which of course wasn't the rule for Defoe, because Lessing were not born when Defoe wrote this book. But I mean, these principles summarized by Lessing already existed in the culture. This rule breaking prepares for this specific thing. So, of course, aesthetic rules are productive in the way that they can be used for effects, and they can also be broken for effects. And the same you can say for media differences. Ellerström uses the word tension when you use a medium to push these borders. When you're trying to do a description in verbal language, where you try to make a narrative to a painting, these things, where you're trying to do other things, where the sign system doesn't really fit very well, so you have to push it. And one of the things you see in this A to B, B to A example is that maps has some sort of reflexivity connected to the map grid, the reference grid system, which doesn't exist in the same way in texts. And of course, the rules for negation and disjunction are different. So, a text-based map, the map based on the text is not the space of the text. The space of the text you see when you open the book. The space of the text is the graphical thing you see before you start picking up words and reading words. It's a space of a reading of the text. It's a space created by the human reader. Always. Even if the human reader might use an algorithm on a computer for doing it, it's still created by the human reader. And maps can be used for deforming texts, for critical engagement and feeding back on the text, making us see the text in a new way, deforming, taking from again. And this means that text can always be mapped into different maps, which means there are different readings. Which means that in a way, if you see a text as the interaction between the reading entity and the document, it becomes a different text. So this happy family we see with maps and texts playing together, like in geocommunication systems, GPS route finding systems, or even the maps and the text on the desk of a researcher or a reader, we always see this kind of using several media to get the full picture. This is a happy family. I use it myself. It's very nice, but it's threatened by tension, and tension is very exciting. This is great fun to see how they can really fight each other. Thank you.